April 1945. As the Third Reich crumbled and Allied forces closed in, a strange report spread across the front lines. A German tank so massive, so unstoppable, that it seemed invincible. Allied shells bounced harmlessly from its armor. Whole platoons vanished after a single encounter. Soldiers called it the ghost of steel. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind only wreckage and silence. No serial number. No photographs. Nothing. Was it destroyed, hidden, or buried beneath history itself? This is the story of the tank that terrified the Allies, and then disappeared without a trace. Germany, 1942. The war that had once promised swift victories was now devouring its creators. The Eastern Front bled men and machines faster than factories could replace them. And in the West, Allied bombers ruled the skies. Yet amid the ruins and the desperation, one vision still burned bright, a dream of technological salvation. Adolf Hitler called it the miracle weapon, a machine so fearsome, so indestructible, that it would restore German dominance on every battlefield. If the enemy could produce thousands of tanks, he would create one they could never destroy. The idea reached the drawing boards of Germany's finest engineers, names like Porsche and Henschel, men already responsible for the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks. But this time, the order was different. The Führer demanded something bigger, something unthinkable. Design memos from the period spoke of a mobile fortress, a tank weighing more than 180 tons, armed with a gun capable of destroying any Allied armor before the enemy could even return fire. It was not meant merely to fight. It was meant to terrify. Inside the Henschel design workshops, draftsmen worked by candlelight as air raid sirens wailed overhead. Sketches of monstrous vehicles littered the tables, massive turrets, overlapping armor plates thicker than a man's arm, tracks wider than a soldier was tall, each concept more extreme than the last. They called it the Überpanzer, the supertank. Engineers debated how to make it move. Standard Maybach engines couldn't bear the weight. 2 engines might tear themselves apart. Electric drives were tested, but overheated after a few minutes. Yet orders from Berlin were absolute. It must move, it must fight, it must inspire fear. To those who saw the blueprints, it was madness wrapped in steel. But to Hitler, it was destiny. By 1943, a small prototype team began assembly at a secret testing ground near Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. Allied intelligence had no knowledge of it. Even within the Wehrmacht, few officers were told. Those who worked on it recalled the ground shaking as the first sections of armor were welded into place. The turret alone weighed as much as an entire Panzer IV. Its main gun, a 128mm high-velocity cannon, could punch through a Sherman or Churchill tank at over 2 kilometers. It needed no finesse. It was built to annihilate. Yet for all its power, the machine came at a cost. Every meter it moved consumed fuel at a staggering rate. Bridges collapsed under its weight. Roads cracked and buckled. It was a monster that Germany's own infrastructure could barely sustain. Still, the propaganda ministry loved it. In internal reports, it was described as the symbol of the new German will. A weapon that would crush fear itself. Photographs were forbidden. Its existence, officially, was a state secret. And yet, the whispers spread. Factory workers spoke of a tank so large that men could walk upright inside its hull. Soldiers stationed nearby heard the distant thunder of test runs at night. One described it years later in an interview. You didn't see it, you felt it. The earth moved, like something ancient waking up. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the tide was turning. The Red Army advanced westward. The Allies prepared to invade Normandy. Germany was running out of time. The Überpanzer project was not just an experiment anymore. It was a last hope. In late 1943, one prototype rolled under its own power. Its thick steel plates glowed from welding heat as it emerged into daylight. The men watching fell silent. It was enormous, longer than a city bus, heavier than a destroyer's gun turret. Its presence alone seemed to defy logic. When its engine roared to life, a column of black smoke rose above the test field. Trees trembled in its wake. But even as the engineers cheered, some knew the truth. The tank might crush enemies, but it could also crush Germany's remaining resources. Each vehicle required enough steel to build 5 regular tanks. The rail system could barely move it. Its massive gun had to be custom forged, delaying other weapons production. Still, Hitler was pleased. He ordered limited production, 3 prototypes, with field trials scheduled for late 1944. The Allies will tremble when they see it, he declared. They would, but not for long. In the shadows of that decision lay a tragedy of ambition. The German High Command was divided. Some officers saw the tank as an engineering marvel. Others saw it as a death sentence, a slow, overbuilt target that could not maneuver, a monument to hubris. And as history would soon reveal, they were both right. The machine that promised salvation would soon roll into battle. But before it could change the war, it would vanish, taking with it every secret, every blueprint, and every soul who tried to understand it. Berlin, early 1943. The war room beneath the Reich Chancellery buzzed with tension. Maps littered the long oak table, red arrows pressing toward Germany from every direction. The Eastern Front was bleeding out. Stalingrad had fallen. Allied bombers darkened the skies above the Ruhr, pounding the industrial heart of the Reich. Adolf Hitler paced the floor, his hands trembling, eyes feverish with frustration. Each report delivered by his generals painted the same picture: defeat by numbers. The Allies had more tanks, more planes, more men. Germany's once unstoppable war machine was being buried under the weight of Allied industry. To Hitler, that was unacceptable. He refused to believe that superior will could be outmatched by mere quantity. If the enemy had thousands of tanks, he would create one that none of them could destroy. "Give me a weapon that will make the world tremble again," he demanded. "Something that cannot be stopped. Something that will remind them who rules the battlefield." The order went out to Germany's greatest designers: Henschel, Krupp, Porsche, Daimler-Benz. They were told to defy physics itself, build a tank larger, stronger, and more heavily armed than anything conceived before. Generals like Heinz Guderian and Albert Speer protested quietly. They argued for practicality: faster, lighter tanks, more suited to Germany's dwindling fuel supply and shrinking resources. But Hitler was beyond reason. His obsession with Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons, had consumed him. He believed that one decisive weapon could turn the tide of the war, just as the V-2 rocket and Me-262 jet fighter were promised to do. He didn't want another tank. He wanted a symbol of invincibility. Blueprints began flooding in. Some were merely scaled-up Tigers, others radical new concepts with electric drives, twin engines, and 200mm armor plates. Hitler reviewed each design personally. Witnesses later recalled his excitement as he traced his finger across the silhouette of the largest proposal: a tank that would weigh nearly 190 tons and mount a naval cannon capable of piercing any Allied armor from miles away. "This," he reportedly said, tapping the drawing, "will crush their spirit." The generals in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what such a project meant. Months of diverted resources, thousands of tons of steel, and precious fuel that Germany no longer had. But no one dared to object. Hitler's word was law, and questioning his vision could mean more than dismissal. Orders were issued to Henschel and Porsche to begin parallel developments. The project received the code name Mammoth, later changed to Project 205. On paper, it was an engineering masterpiece, a mobile fortress. In reality, it was an impossible dream born in a crumbling empire. By mid-1943, work began at a secret facility near Kummersdorf, and later at Böblingen. The Reich Ministry of Armaments prioritized it above nearly every other armored vehicle. Trainloads of high-grade steel arrived under escort. Workers were sworn to secrecy. Even within the Wehrmacht, few knew of the supertank. Every design requirement pushed limits. Armor 250mm thick on the front, a massive 128mm gun, crew of 6. Range limited to barely 100 kilometers due to fuel consumption. Bridges could not support its weight. It had to ford rivers or travel by special railway cars. But to Hitler, none of that mattered. He saw only the propaganda value, a weapon that would restore faith in victory. In speeches to his inner circle, he compared it to medieval siege engines, slow but unstoppable symbols of divine strength. "Let them have their swarms of Shermans and T-34s, he told his staff. "We will unleash one beast that none of them can face." By late 1944, As Germany's situation grew desperate, the obsession intensified. The supertank was no longer a concept, it was an order. Hitler demanded that one prototype be ready for combat evaluation before the end of the year. Under relentless pressure, engineers cut corners, scavenged parts from Tiger production lines, and worked day and night under Allied bombing raids. Fuel was rationed, power was unreliable, yet somehow, progress continued. As the Allied invasion of France gathered pace, Hitler's private secretary recorded one of his late-night tirades. "The Americans think they can drown us with numbers. We will show them the strength of German will. A single tank will do what 100 cannot." But even among his closest aides, whispers grew. The generals called it Wahnsinn, madness. They saw the pattern. Vast resources poured into monstrous prototypes that could never exist in real numbers. Each miracle weapon drained fuel, time, and manpower from the front. Still, the factories worked on, their workers hunched under flickering lights. They didn't know if they were building salvation or a steel coffin. When the prototype finally neared completion, those who saw it described a haunting sight. A machine so immense it dwarfed everything around it, a beast of armor and power born not of strategy, but of obsession. And yet, this was only the beginning. Soon, this weapon, the largest and most feared tank Germany had ever produced, would roll onto the battlefield, and just as swiftly, it would disappear, leaving behind only wreckage, rumor, and fear. The orders from Berlin were absolute. Build it, no matter the cost. And so, in the winter of 1943, Germany's engineers began forging the impossible. The supertank, as Hitler called it, was no longer just an idea scribbled in a notebook. It was becoming real, a monster of steel rising from the heart of a dying empire. Inside the Henschel works at Kassel, sparks showered from welding torches as men in soot-covered uniforms worked under blackout conditions. Allied bombers thundered above the clouds, but production never stopped. The Reich's fate, they were told, depended on this machine. Every problem they solved created two more. The tank's armor, nearly 10 inches thick at the front, made conventional tools useless. New forges had to be built to heat and bend the massive steel plates. Bolts snapped under their own weight. The cranes meant to lift turret sections groaned and failed. Engineers joked grimly that the tank's first victim might be the factory itself. The specifications were staggering. Weight, 188 tons. Length, 10 meters. Armor, 200 mm front, 180 mm sides. Gun, 128 mm Coque. 44, the same used on Germany's most feared tank destroyers. 2 Maybach engines were mounted side by side to drive its immense bulk. Even so, the tank could barely reach 20 kilometers per hour on flat ground. On soft earth, it sank like a stone. It consumed fuel like a battleship, nearly 2 liters for every 100 meters. But when its engines roared, the ground trembled. Witnesses said it sounded like thunder trapped inside a metal cage. A test driver recorded in his notes, "When you press the throttle, the air itself seems to shake. You feel both pride and terror. Pride at what man can build, and terror that you might never stop it once it starts." By early 1944, the first prototype was complete, a looming black silhouette under the lights of the proving ground at Böblingen. It stood taller than a house. Soldiers who saw it for the first time fell silent, their faces lit by the dull glow of floodlights. The test commander gave the signal. Engines ignited with a deep, grinding growl. Exhaust smoke poured into the night. Slowly, the behemoth moved forward, its tracks churning mud and concrete alike. Every gear shift echoed like a gunshot. For a moment, even the skeptics believed they were witnessing the future. The test firing began at dawn. Target, a decommissioned Panzer IV positioned 1,500 meters away. The gunner took aim. The massive 120mm round left the barrel with a flash that lit the hillsides. The target didn't explode, it disintegrated. Cheers erupted from the engineers and officers. One man wrote in his diary, "The shell went clean through the tank and the bunker behind it. There is no armor on Earth that can withstand this." But triumph turned quickly to dread. The gun's recoil nearly tore the turret mounting apart. Bolts sheared, seals burst. The engines overheated within minutes. One track section cracked under the strain, immobilizing the tank where it stood. The miracle weapon had revealed its curse. It was too powerful for its own design. Repairs took weeks. Replacement parts were impossible to source in wartime conditions. Allied bombers had crippled Germany's steel plants. Fuel convoys rarely arrived intact. Still, Hitler demanded progress. He personally visited the test site in March 1944. Photographs from that day were later confiscated, but eyewitnesses described him standing in silence before the tank, his face lit by the sun's reflection on its armor. After several minutes, he smiled, the kind of smile that frightened even his aides. "This," he said softly, "will make the enemy tremble." Yet beneath the pride, engineers whispered another truth. The monster could barely move. It could not cross bridges, could not climb steep hills, could not even fit through most tunnels. Transporting it required disassembling it into sections, each hauled by rail under guard. Logistically, it was a nightmare. Strategically, it was suicidal. But ideologically, it was perfect. It embodied the fantasy of German invincibility, strength through sheer will. Hitler ordered 2 more prototypes to be completed, one for testing, one for frontline evaluation. Only one would ever make it beyond the proving grounds. That same summer, Allied reconnaissance flights began reporting unidentified armored vehicles, hidden deep within wooded areas near the Rhine. The photographs were blurry, but the shadows cast by the machines were colossal. American intelligence analysts dismissed them as misidentified bunkers. They were wrong. The monster was moving, slowly, but unmistakably, toward the front. For the men who built it, it was both pride and prophecy. They had given shape to Hitler's obsession, a tank too heavy to fight and too fearsome to ignore. And when it finally reached the battlefield, the world would see why even the bravest Allied crews would remember it not as a weapon, but as a nightmare. Western Front, December 1944. The Ardennes lay cloaked in fog, a gray ocean of trees and frozen rivers. Allied soldiers called it the Forest of Ghosts, silent, endless, and treacherous. Few suspected that deep within those woods, Germany was preparing one final strike. Among the columns of Panthers and Tiger IIs stood something the Allies had never seen before. A single machine, colossal and grim, covered in frost and camouflage netting. To the German soldiers escorting it, it seemed more myth than metal. To the enemy, it would soon become both. The Überpanzer, Hitler's supertank, had finally arrived at the front. It was assigned to a special detachment of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, operating under absolute secrecy. Even the accompanying officers received limited information. Orders were simple: protect the prototype, unleash it only in moments of crisis, and ensure it never fell into enemy hands. The crew chosen to operate it were among the most experienced in the German army. Veterans of Kursk, Normandy, and Caen. Their commander, Oberleutnant Hans Brecht, had fought in every major campaign since 1939. He had seen the tide of war turn, had watched the Allies grow stronger while the Wehrmacht shrank. Now, as he climbed into the dark interior of the new tank, he felt something unfamiliar: awe. Inside, the air smelled of oil, metal, and fear. 6 men took their positions: driver, gunner, loader, radio operator, mechanic, and Brecht himself in the commander's cupola. The controls hummed with raw energy. When the engines came alive, the entire hull vibrated like a beast awakening. It felt, one crewman later said, as if the earth itself moved to make room for it. Their mission: block an Allied armored column advancing toward the village of Lichtenborn, a quiet place soon to be burned into legend. The encounter. Morning broke with a blinding mist. Allied reconnaissance units, mostly Shermans and M10 tank destroyers, pushed cautiously along the road. The men were tired, confident the Germans were in retreat. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to rise from the ground. At first they thought it was artillery, but as the fog lifted, they saw it. A black shape, immense and hulking, emerging through the smoke. A tank, no, a fortress, crawling forward, each track the width of a man's shoulders. The lead Sherman fired first. The shell struck the monster's front armor and ricocheted off like a pebble. A metallic scream echoed through the valley. Then, before anyone could react, the German gun roared. The first Allied tank vanished in a bloom of orange fire. The second was ripped apart seconds later. It was like watching thunder explode, recalled Corporal William Hodge, who survived the ambush. "We hit it again and again, and it didn't even flinch." The Oberpanzer advanced relentlessly. Trees splintered as its massive gun traversed with deliberate precision. The psychological effect was immediate. Entire platoons began to withdraw. Radio operators shouted conflicting orders. Gunners fired blindly. In 15 minutes, 4 Allied tanks were destroyed, 3 more disabled. Infantry scattered into the woods, reporting a new Tiger of unimaginable size. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the machine stopped firing. Smoke drifted across the clearing. Allied artillery began zeroing in on its position. And just when the counterattack began, the German tank reversed course, disappearing into the fog as quietly as it had arrived. When American units finally reached the village hours later, they found wrecked Shermans, cratered ground, and strange impressions in the frozen mud, nearly a meter deep, stretching off into the forest. Panic and propaganda. Within days, rumors spread across the Allied front lines. Soldiers spoke of a phantom tank, one that shrugged off direct hits and destroyed entire columns before melting back into the mist. At headquarters, intelligence officers dismissed the accounts as exaggerated. Some claimed it was a misidentified Tiger II. Others thought it was artillery fire mistaken for armor. But then, intercepted German transmissions confirmed the existence of a new prototype vehicle, designation unknown, operating under High Command's direct supervision. The legend grew. Soldiers whispered about the ghost of Lichtenborn. Even the Germans used its myth to their advantage. Propaganda leaflets dropped behind Allied lines boasted of the invincible panzer that no enemy shell can pierce. It wasn't entirely true, but it didn't have to be. Fear was the weapon now. Meanwhile, Oberleutnant Brecht's crew received new orders. The supertank was to move east, toward the Rhine, avoiding capture at all costs. Repairs were made in secret barns and workshops at night. Civilians were forbidden to speak of it. One mechanic who worked briefly on the vehicle later recalled, "We replaced broken suspension arms using steel from church bells. It was so heavy, it crushed the floor beneath it. Every kilometer was a battle." Fuel shortages forced them to siphon gasoline from retreating convoys. Each movement risked detection by Allied air patrols. Yet somehow, they kept moving, a monster limping toward its next engagement. The second battle. A week later, the tank struck again, this time near the town of Prum. Allied forces advancing through the hills encountered it in the ruins of a farmhouse. Once again, their shells failed to penetrate. The Germans used its firepower to cover a large-scale retreat across the river. The tank destroyed 5 vehicles before disappearing once more. Aerial reconnaissance was scrambled, but by the time planes arrived, only smoking wrecks and deep tracks remained. No trace of the supertank itself. The aftermath. By late December, as the German counteroffensive faltered, the mysterious tank was withdrawn from the front. Official German records stopped mentioning it entirely. No unit lists it. No serial number survived. But Allied soldiers remembered. They spoke of the enormous shape that came out of the fog, unstoppable, unshakable, and then was gone. For the men who saw it, the war had briefly become something else. A fight against an enemy that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't just a tank, one veteran said years later. It was a nightmare made real, and then it disappeared like a bad dream. The German supertank had done its job, not as a weapon of victory but as a weapon of terror. Yet its final disappearance, how and where it vanished, remains one of the strangest mysteries of the war. And what happened next would only deepen that legend. By the spring of 1945, Allied armies were closing in from every direction. From the skies, bombers turned cities to dust. From the east, the Red Army thundered toward Berlin. And yet, through the chaos and confusion, one rumor refused to die. The story of a German tank that could not be stopped. They called it many names. The Steel Ghost, the Monster of Lichtenborn, the Phantom Panzer. To the men who fought in its shadow, it was more than a story. It was a warning. The whispers in the ranks. Corporal James R. Collins of the U.S. 4th Armored Division remembered hearing the first reports on a cold morning near Bitburg. Guys said there was a Tiger the size of a house that couldn't be scratched, no matter what you hit it with. They said one shell from it could blow 3 tanks apart. We laughed it off, until we saw the wrecks. The men found Sherman tanks torn open like tin cans, their armor punctured clean through by holes larger than any known German gun could make. Engineers examining the wrecks couldn't identify the weapon. The angles were too sharp, the penetration too deep. Some officers blamed captured anti-tank guns. Others insisted it was artillery fire. But to those who'd seen it, the shape, the sound, the impossible power, there was no doubt. Something new had appeared on the battlefield. A survivor's account. In a post-war interview, Sergeant William Hodge described the day his unit was ambushed near Lichtenborn. "We were rolling up the road when we heard it. Deep, like thunder. Not the sharp crack of a gun, but something lower, heavier. We thought it was artillery at first. Then it came out of the mist. Big, black. No markings. It moved slow, steady, like it didn't even care we were shooting." His voice faltered when he recalled what came next. "We hit it with everything. 75 meter, 76 me. Even a bazooka team from the ditch. Nothing. The shells bounced. It fired once, and the lead tank was gone. Not knocked out, gone, like the ground swallowed it." Hodge survived only because his vehicle was thrown into a ditch by the shockwave of an explosion. When he crawled out hours later, the field was empty. No sign of the tank, just tracks leading into the forest. For years, he insisted it was no ordinary tiger or king tiger. "This thing was wrong," he told historians. "Too big, too quiet, like something that wasn't supposed to exist." Reports and denials. By February 1945, Allied intelligence began collecting field reports referencing unknown German heavy armor. These were compiled under the code name Project Grey Steel, a file that would remain classified for decades. A British intelligence summary from that period reads, "Field observations indicate a possible new variant of the Tiger series, unusually large, highly armored, and possibly employing an oversized naval gun. No photographic evidence available. Reports conflicting." The British, ever cautious, dismissed it as panic under pressure. But the Americans weren't so sure. Reconnaissance pilots were instructed to photograph all unusual track formations and structures resembling heavy armor facilities. In March, one such pilot flying over the Moselle Valley captured something strange, a massive rectangular outline partially covered by netting, too large to be a tiger, too small to be a bunker. The image was sent to London but never conclusively analyzed. The photo was labeled "Unidentified Armored Object, Destroyed in Subsequent Raid." The German side captured German officers were questioned after the war about secret weapons. Most denied any knowledge. But one, Major Erich Wolf, hinted at something extraordinary. "There was a machine," he said during interrogation. "A special tank. It was meant to inspire fear, not to win battles. Even we didn't believe it could work. But it did. Once." When pressed for details, he refused to elaborate. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you," he said. "And besides, it's gone." His statement was buried in the archives, dismissed as psychological warfare. The psychological war. The phantom tank became a kind of superstition among Allied troops. Whenever a patrol went missing or a column was hit by unseen fire, soldiers blamed the ghost. One war correspondent noted in his diary, "They talk about it the way medieval soldiers spoke of dragons, half fear, half fascination. Commanders worried the rumor might harm morale, so official bulletins denied its existence." Yet privately, officers admitted that something unexplained had happened during the Ardennes offensive. General Omar Bradley himself reportedly asked intelligence to look into the matter. The resulting report concluded only, "No credible evidence of a new German tank class found." However, the consistency of soldier testimonies remains concerning. The legacy of fear. By war's end, the story had become part of Allied trench folklore, retold in mess halls and veteran reunions for decades. Some swore they saw its shadow through the fog, its cannon glinting under the moonlight. Others believed it was just a myth, a trick of fear and exhaustion. But every so often, someone would recall a detail that no one could explain. The massive tracks leading nowhere, the deep gouges in the earth, the missing tanks, never recovered, never photographed. Even after Germany's surrender, Allied engineers searched captured facilities for blueprints of the so-called supertank. They found references to the E-series and the Mouse, but none matched the descriptions from the field. One British officer summed it up best. If it existed, it vanished perfectly, and if it didn't, then fear itself built it. The war was nearly over, but for those who had faced it, or thought they had, the memory of that dark shape in the mist would never fade. And soon, as Germany began its final retreat, the legend would take its strangest turn yet. Because what vanished next wasn't just the tank, but every record of its existence. March 1945. Germany was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were only weeks from Berlin. In every direction, the Third Reich was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. Cities burned, factories fell silent, and entire divisions vanished into surrender or destruction. But deep within the chaos, one order from Berlin remained clear. No prototype is to fall into enemy hands. In the forests outside Kassel, the men of Oberleutnant Brecht's crew received their final mission. The Überpanzer, the last of its kind, was to be evacuated east. No one was told where. No records were kept. The tank's designation was erased from command logs. Its production files were burned. They would move by night, using abandoned roads and forest paths, heading toward Bavaria. Every kilometer was a struggle. "We were driving a mountain," Brecht later recalled in his journal, which disappeared with him. "Every turn threatened to kill the machine, or us." Fuel was scarce, and Allied air patrols ruled the skies. The tank's engines coughed black smoke visible for miles. To avoid detection, the crew often stopped during daylight, camouflaging the hull with branches and mud. Each day, they lost more support vehicles. First the repair truck, bombed on a back road. Then the fuel convoy, ambushed by strafing fighters. By the time they reached the Thuringian Hills, only the tank remained, crawling through mud like a wounded beast. The last transmission. On April 7, 1945, a brief radio message was intercepted by Allied intelligence near Fulda. It came from a German frequency. Weak, distorted, almost drowned in static. "Damaged. Cannot proceed. Orders. Bury it. Heil." Then silence. The message was traced to a small valley near the town of Schweine, an area later occupied by American troops. When reconnaissance units arrived 3 days later, they found nothing. No vehicles, no tracks, no wrecks. Just scorched earth and the faint smell of diesel. Witnesses of the retreat, local villagers, spoke of hearing an earthquake one night, a rumble so deep their windows shattered. Others claimed they saw fires in the forest and German soldiers working through the night. One farmer told Allied investigators, "They dug something enormous. You could hear metal scraping. Then there was an explosion, and after that, nothing." The site was searched, but no debris was found. Only a patch of ground that seemed unnaturally disturbed, as if something had been buried and hastily covered. When questioned, captured engineers denied everything. "No such vehicle ever existed," one said. "If it did," another muttered, "you will never find it." The burning of evidence. As Berlin prepared for its final defense, orders were issued to destroy all records of advanced weapon projects. Blueprints for experimental tanks, aircraft, and missiles were burned in massive bonfires outside the Reich Ministry of Armaments. The Überpanzer vanished from production lists entirely. No serial numbers, no photographs, not even a test log survived. It was as if the machine, and everything connected to it, had been erased from history by design. Even the engineers who worked on it disappeared. Some were killed during the Allied bombings. Others went missing on their way to surrender. A few resurfaced years later in Soviet territory, but none ever spoke of the project again. One of them, Kurt Heinemann, hinted at its fate during an interview in 1951. The tank was real, but it was never meant to fight again. When it broke down, they did what they had to do. They buried it, and themselves with it. He refused to elaborate further. Rumors and theories. After the war, Allied investigators scoured captured facilities for evidence of the mysterious supertank. They found fragments, incomplete blueprints labeled Project 205, engine parts too large for any known vehicle, and test logs referencing a third prototype never accounted for. The Maus, another massive experimental tank, was discovered in pieces at Kummersdorf, confirming that such engineering projects had indeed existed. But the tank described by soldiers, larger, faster, and seen in combat, didn't match the Mouse's dimensions or design. So where had it gone? Some claimed it was hidden in a mine shaft near Schweine before the crew detonated the entrance. Others believed it sank into a river while attempting to cross under fire. A few conspiracy theorists insisted the Soviets secretly recovered it and transported it east for study. But none of these theories could be proven. The ghost in the ground. In 1967, a group of amateur historians surveyed the region near Schweine using ground-penetrating radar. They discovered a massive metallic anomaly buried roughly 12 meters below the surface, rectangular, roughly the size of a large tank. Permission to excavate was denied. The site sat on former East German military land, classified by Soviet authorities. When researchers returned in the 1990s after reunification, the anomaly was gone. The soil had been disturbed, excavated, and refilled. To this day, no one knows what was removed. The end of the monster. By April 1945, the war was effectively over. The crew of the Überpanzer were never seen again. Their names do not appear on casualty lists or POW rosters. It's as if they vanished alongside their machine. "We heard rumors," said one post-war German officer. "They were ordered to destroy the tank and ensure it could never be found. They followed orders, to the letter." Whether buried in a forgotten valley or dismantled piece by piece, the tank that had terrified the Allies simply ceased to exist. But for decades afterward, the legend endured, whispered by veterans, speculated by historians, and feared by those who remembered the night when the earth trembled under something that should not have been. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of pride, of madness, of a nation trying to hold back the inevitable with steel and dreams. And when the end came, that symbol, like the Reich itself, sank into silence. The war ended, but the legend did not. Even as Europe rebuilt from the ashes, whispers of the vanished German monster refused to fade. Allied soldiers returned home with stories of a tank that no bullet could pierce, no shell could destroy. At first, historians dismissed it as battlefield myth, another ghost born of smoke and fear. But then the files began to surface. The search begins. In 1946, Allied intelligence teams combed the ruins of Germany's weapons factories. At Henschel and Krupp, they found fragments of blueprints referencing Project 205, E-100, and Maus. But one report, marked confidential, not for release, mentioned a third design, heavier, faster, and operationally tested under combat conditions. The document ended abruptly, its final pages torn out. Engineers who survived the bombings were interrogated. Most claimed ignorance. A few, under pressure, hinted at something stranger. "It existed," one said quietly, "but it was lost before the surrender. You will not find it." The Americans, fascinated by the technology, launched Operation Paperclip, recruiting German scientists and engineers. Many who had worked on heavy tank projects were brought to the U.S. for study. Yet when questioned about the rumored prototype, they gave only evasive answers, or nervous smiles. The Soviets' obsession. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Soviet intelligence had begun its own investigation. Reports from their occupation zones hinted that something large and metallic was buried deep in Thuringia. Soviet engineers cordoned off several forested valleys, declaring them restricted zones. For years, nothing more was heard. Then, in 1953, a declassified CIA memo referenced Soviet excavation activity near former German weapons testing grounds, possibly related to heavy armor recovery. No photographs accompanied the report. No confirmation ever followed. Whatever the Soviets found, they never shared it. The treasure hunters. By the 1960s, the ghost tank had entered legend. Treasure hunters scoured the forests of Bavaria and Thuringia, armed with metal detectors and wartime maps. Some claimed to find broken treads and rusted bolts far larger than those of a tiger. Others found nothing at all. In 1971, a retired Wehrmacht mechanic named Alfred Kruger contacted a West German journalist with a startling claim. "I worked on the beast," he said. "It wasn't destroyed. It was hidden." He described a night in April 1945 when German troops sealed a cavern with explosives after pushing a massive vehicle inside. When the journalist asked for proof, Kruger produced a rough sketch: a tunnel entrance near the Wartburg Mountains. A small team investigated the site. They found collapsed rock, traces of steel cables, and faint readings on magnetometers. But no tank. Kruger died the following year. His story was never verified. The modern search. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, new discoveries reignited the mystery. In 1994, an amateur archaeology group using ground-penetrating radar near Schweine detected a rectangular metallic mass roughly 10 meters long and 5 meters wide. The shape matched the dimensions of the rumored Überpanzer. Before they could excavate, local authorities halted the dig, citing unexploded ordnance and environmental concerns. When the site reopened months later, the anomaly was gone. The soil had been disturbed, the ground refilled. No official record of the removal exists. In the 2000s, satellite imagery showed similar anomalies in nearby valleys. Long, linear shapes buried deep underground, far from any known wartime site. Some historians now believe the Soviets may have secretly retrieved the remains decades earlier. Others insist the tank still lies beneath German soil, entombed in silence. The enduring mystery. Even today, researchers debate its existence. Was it an early version of the Mouse, a prototype from the E-series, or something built only once? A single monster born of desperation and destroyed to hide the madness that created it. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. No photographs, no wreckage, no verified records have ever been found. Yet every few years, a new witness emerges. A farmer, a former soldier, a diver who claims to have seen something huge under the mud. Each story keeps the legend alive. Because sometimes, history's greatest mysteries are not the things we remember, but the things we're never meant to find. The war is long over. The guns have fallen silent, the cities rebuilt, and the soldiers who once faced each other across burning fields have grown old. But the story of the tank that vanished still echoes, not just in the forests of Germany, but in the darker corners of history itself. Because the Überpanzer, whether real or myth, was more than a machine. It was the final expression of an empire's madness. Born from fear, fueled by pride, and buried by defeat. The symbol of a dying Reich. In the final months of the war, Germany's leadership turned to miracles instead of strategy. Each new weapon, the jet fighter, the rocket, the giant tank, was supposed to restore what could no longer be saved. They called them Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons. But in truth, they were monuments to desperation. The Überpanzer was the ultimate example. It was never a tool of victory. It was a monument to illusion. A weapon built not for war, but for the fantasy of invincibility. It consumed resources that might have fed cities, fuel that might have saved lives, and engineers who might have rebuilt rather than destroyed. One German historian later wrote, "It was the perfect metaphor for the Reich itself, massive, powerful, and doomed by its own weight." The modern legacy today, gamers and military enthusiasts still marvel at recreations of the German supertanks, the Maus, the E-100, and countless what-if designs. They appear in simulations and documentaries, their digital ghosts rolling through the same muddy fields their real counterparts once scarred. But the true story, the legend of the vanished tank, carries something deeper. It reminds us that power without purpose becomes self-destruction. That even the strongest armor cannot protect against arrogance. Some say the machine still lies buried beneath the forests of Thuringia, sealed beneath a century of silence. Others believe it was dismantled, melted down, erased by the victors. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps it exists only in memory, a story born in the fog of war, kept alive by the human need to find meaning in chaos. The final reflection. In the end, no photograph, no fragment of steel, and no engine part remains to prove it was ever real. And maybe that's fitting, because the Überpanzer, like so many dreams of conquest, belonged to an age when men believed machines could make them gods. But in the smoke of their own creation, they built their own ghosts instead. The Allies never found the tank. History never closed the file. And so in the forests of Germany, beneath layers of time and earth, The legend sleeps, silent, unseen, and unforgettable. A monster forged in steel and pride, that terrified the Allies, and then vanished without a trace.